In the cave beneath the mountain, where no light has ever found its way through stone, Hypnos lies on a bed of black ebony and does not stir. Around him, in the darkness and the silence, his sons are gathered, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. The ancient writers never settled on a number because a number would have made them feel too small. They are the dream spirits, the Wanaroi, each carrying within them a different shape to press into a sleeping mind, and among them, moving with the particular steadiness of a craftsman who has never once rushed, is the one their father will choose when the work requires the greatest care. His name is Morpheus. Ovid describes the scene in the 11th book of his Metamorphoses, written in Rome around the year 8 of the Common Era, and his description has the quality of something seen rather than invented, a hollow mountain deep beneath the earth, where the ground outside the entrance is carpeted with poppies, nodding in a stillness so complete that there is almost nothing to distinguish wakefulness from sleep. The cave itself allows no dawn in, no midday, no evening. Whatever light exists in the wider world has not been invited here. Inside, the poppies do their quiet work. The air carries the weight of a place that has been undisturbed since before the ordering of the world. On his black ebony bed, Hypnos reclines. His sons drift around him in the dark, each one a different instrument for a different kind of dream. Some will become animals in the minds of sleepers. Some will carry deceptions. Some will bring news that could not reach a waking person through any ordinary channel. But when the goddess Juno requires something precise, when the errand is delicate, when the dream must be so exact that the sleeper cannot suspect it as a dream at all, Hypnos turns among his gathered sons and selects the one he always selects for work of that particular kind. Morpheus, Ovid writes, is the most skilled among them at imitating the human form. He can take on a person's walk, their voice, the way they hold their shoulders, the specific expression that crosses a familiar face before it speaks. He can assemble a human being out of sleep and darkness and deliver it to a dreamer with such fidelity that when the figure opens its mouth, the dreamer hears the exact voice of someone they have known their entire life. This is his function. This is the thing that sets him apart from all the others gathered in that cave. Not the ability to produce visions or sensations, or the feeling of falling, or the inexplicable geography of rooms that change when approached. Any of the dream spirits could manage those. What Morpheus does is harder. He makes people. He makes them precisely. He makes them well enough that a sleeping mind, which knows on some level that it is dreaming, does not notice the seam. And so, the name Morpheus carries its own meaning on the surface of it, available to anyone who knew the language it came from. In ancient Greek, the noun morphe means form or shape. It is the word for the visible appearance of a thing, the outline of it, the way it presents itself to perception, the specific arrangement of qualities that makes something recognizable as itself rather than something else. When ancient writers used the name Morpheus, they were using a name that described his work directly. He is the one who gives form. He is the one who shapes. In the space inside a sleeping person's mind, where the raw material of a dream has no fixed outline yet, Morpheus arrives and begins to assemble a shape that the dreamer will accept as real. Ovid knew this. He knew that the name pointed toward the function, and he describes Morpheus with a precision that suggests he found the figure genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. Among the 1,000 sons of Hypnos, Ovid writes, Morpheus is the most skilled at counterfeiting human appearances. He can walk the way a person walks. He can speak with a person's voice, giving it the particular grain and rhythm that distinguishes one human voice from every other. He can dress himself in the clothes of a specific person and arrange his body in the posture of that person, and arrive in a dream so completely assembled that the sleeper has no way of knowing they are looking at a construction rather than at someone they love. This, Ovid tells his readers, is why Hypnos chooses him for the important errands. This is why, when the task requires a human face, the others step aside. There is something worth sitting with in that image. In the cave, in the dark, among his brothers, Morpheus is the craftsman. Not the most powerful of Hypnos' sons, perhaps, and not the most famous in the way that Olympian gods were famous, not Zeus with his thunderbolt, or Apollo with his light. He is something quieter and more specific than that. He is the one with the steadiest hands. He is the one who the steadiest hands. He is the one who, given the shape of a face, and the sound of a voice, and the way a particular person moves through a room, can reassemble those things inside a dream with such care that grief and recognition and love all respond to the figure he has made, the way they would respond to the real thing. The family Morpheus belongs to is worth tracing because it runs older than Olympus. His father Hypnos is the god of sleep, not a minor figure in the Greek tradition, despite the quietness of his domain. Sleep was understood as one of the genuine powers, one of the things that governed human experience at the most fundamental level, as inescapable and as necessary as death, and far more regularly encountered. Hypnos lives in his cave beneath the earth and sends his sons out each night across the world, and the world cannot resist them. Even Zeus, the greatest of the Olympian gods, was put to sleep by Hypnos at Hera's request in a famous episode from the Iliad. The god of sleep does not defer to the king of the gods in quite the way the Olympian hierarchy might suggest. Sleep comes for everything. Sleep has always come for everything. The power to send it belongs to a god who was old before Olympus existed. Hypnos has a twin brother, and that brother is Thanatos, the god of death. They are depicted together in ancient art on the Euphronios crater, a red-figured vessel dating to around 515 BCE. The two brothers carry the body of Sarpedon between them with an expression of calm attention, their wings spread, their faces undisturbed, performing a work they have performed before and will perform again in the endless procession of mortal lives. They are twins, which is to say that the tradition understood sleep and death as companion powers, as things that resemble each other closely enough to share a face. The difference between them is the difference between a temporary crossing and a permanent one. In sleep, you approach the boundary and return. In death, you do not. But the approach is the same. The moment before sleep and the moment before death were understood, in this tradition, as the same threshold, attended by brothers. Their mother is Nyx. In the Greek cosmological tradition, Nyx is the goddess of night, not simply darkness as an absence of light, but night as a primordial force, as one of the fundamental conditions of existence that preceded the gods, who would later come to govern a world that had already been organized into its basic structures before they arrived. Hesiod places Nyx among the very first things that existed in his Theogony, a cosmological poem composed sometime in the 8th or 7th century BCE, listing her among the primordial entities who emerged from chaos at the very beginning of everything. She is that old. She is older than the sky and the earth understood as deities. She is older than the Titans and older than the gods who overthrew them. Night was there first, and from night came a family that the tradition understood as fundamental rather than divine in the Olympian sense, not gods who governed specific domains of human interest and required particular cults and temples, but powers that simply were, woven into the structure of existence so deeply that there was no aspect of life untouched by at least one of them. Death was one of night's children, sleep was another, and Morpheus, standing in the dark cave among his 1,000 brothers, with his particular gift for assembling a face and a voice and a posture into something a dreamer will believe, belongs to this family. He is the grandchild of night. He carries within him something older than the gods, who would later become the best known figures of the Greek imagination. It is useful to hold that genealogy quietly, without pressing it toward anything alarming. The association with night, with death, with the primordial darkness before the ordering of the world, none of that was understood as threatening by the tradition itself, at least not in any simple sense. These were the conditions of existence. Night came every day, sleep came every night. Death came eventually, to everything. They were not enemies of the world, but features of it, as old as the world itself, as fundamental as its shape. Morpheus, moving through that lineage, is not a figure emerging from the dangerous edge of things. He is a figure who belongs to the oldest and most basic architecture of the world, the craftsman of the dark, doing precise and particular work in the space between consciousness and oblivion. Ovid's own curiosity about that work is visible in his description. He is writing in Latin in Rome, several centuries after the Greek tradition first gave these figures their names and functions, and he is working with source material that had accumulated considerably by his time. But when he describes the cave of Hypnos, and Hypnos on his black ebony bed, and the dream sons gathered in the darkness, and Morpheus singled out among them, he lingers on the detail in a way that suggests genuine interest in the image rather than merely the story it serves. The black ebony bed is a specific detail. The poppy carpet at the cave's entrance is a specific detail. The praise of Morpheus as the most precise imitator of human form is a specific detail. Ovid understood that the figure was interesting, that the function was interesting, that the idea of a being whose entire purpose was to assemble a convincing human likeness inside the mind of a sleeper was worth describing carefully. There is an image that the tradition implies without quite stating outright, but that Ovid's description makes easy to imagine. A sleeper in the ancient world lying in the dark of their house crosses into sleep, and Morpheus arrives at the edge of that sleep, not visibly, not as himself, and begins to assemble. He takes the raw possibility of a dream and gives it the form of someone the dreamer knows. He settles a posture into place. He adjusts the voice. He ensures that the particular way this person turns their head before they speak, the small and precise and utterly characteristic gesture that no one who loved them could mistake, is present and correct. He steps back in whatever way a dream spirit steps back, and the figure is complete. The dreamer believes it. The dreamer speaks to it. The dreamer reaches toward it. And for the duration of that dream, the construction holds. The work is good enough that nothing gives it away while the dreaming lasts. Only at the edges, only in the slow, disoriented moments of waking, when consciousness reassembles itself from the scattered material of sleep, might the dreamer lie still and try to remember what it was that finally told them. A slight wrongness in the angle of the light. The moment when the voice was not quite right. Or nothing, no wrongness at all. Only the gradual understanding that comes with the return of the waking world, that whatever they were speaking to is no longer there, and that the specific quality of its absence is different from the absence of a living person, in some way the dreamer cannot yet name. Morpheus's name persisted in the tradition long after the specific stories about him were told. It moved through the centuries in the way that mythological names sometimes move, not as a story being actively retold, but as a reference, a shorthand, a way of pointing towards something without describing it at length, because the thing it pointed toward was familiar enough not to require description. Writers and poets in later periods invoked him when they needed to speak about the particular texture of dream, about the convincing inner worlds that sleep assembles, about the faces that appear in sleep with such precision that waking is its own small grief. The name carried the function within it. Morpheus was the shaper. He was the one who gave the forms, and Morphe, the root his name grew from, had a life of its own entirely independent of the god. In ancient Greek, the word appeared in contexts that had nothing to do with dreams, in discussions of appearance and form and the visible shape of things, in philosophical contexts where the distinction between the form of a thing and the substance of it was a matter of serious inquiry. The word was doing its work in the language long before the dream god was fully articulated, and it would continue doing its work long after the worship of the Olympian tradition and its older relatives had ceased to be the living religion of any significant community. What the root Morphe produced across the centuries and the shifting of languages that carried Greek into Latin, and Latin into the vocabularies of Western Europe, and eventually into English, is a family of words so familiar that a modern speaker uses them without any sense of their origin. Morphology is the study of form. In linguistics, the study of how words are shaped. In biology, the study of the form and structure of organisms. The word carries morphe in it, as plainly as a name carries a family. Metamorphosis is transformation, change of form, from the Greek meta, meaning change, and morphe, meaning shape, the word that Ovid himself used as the title of the very poem in which he describes Morpheus assembling the drowned king's likeness in a dream. Amorphous means without form, the Greek as negation, morphe as the thing negated, used in English for substances that have no fixed shape, for structures with no discernible organization, for anything that resists the clarity of a defined outline. A modern person using any of these words is, without knowing it, using something that carries the dream god's root at its center. The word morphology does not know it descends from the same source as the figure standing in the ancient cave among the poppy stems, assembling a face. The word metamorphosis does not know it was coined from the same noun that gave the shaper of dream figures his name. The connection is there, running below the surface of ordinary speech, quiet and persistent and entirely unannounced. There is something pleasant in that persistence, not remarkable in any dramatic sense. These are simply the patterns that etymology follows, the way roots spread through languages, the way roots spread through soil, quietly and in all directions, without particular intention. The noun morphe was useful in ancient Greek because the concept it described, the form of a thing, the visible shape of it, the outline that makes one thing distinguishable from another, was a useful concept, one that kept recurring in different contexts, one that a vocabulary needed a word for. The fact that the same noun was also the root of a dream god's name is a coincidence of the kind that language is full of, and the fact that the dream god and the noun together produced a family of English words that outlasted the religion in which the god was understood as real, that is simply what happened. But it is the kind of thing that is interesting to notice at the right hour in the dark. The connection is invisible in ordinary use. A biologist discussing morphology is not thinking about a cave beneath a mountain where a figure made of sleep and darkness stands at the edge of a sleeping person's consciousness and begins to assemble a face. A person describing a substance as amorphous is not thinking about the negative of the noun that named the god who gave form to the formless interior of a dream. The link exists, and it is traceable, and it runs from that ancient cave all the way through to the present moment, present in words that will be spoken tomorrow by people who have never heard of Morpheus at all. It is worth sitting with Ovid for a moment longer, because he is one of the primary reasons any of this survived in the detail it did. Writing in Rome at the end of the 1st century BCE and the beginning of the 1st century CE, working in a literary culture that had inherited and transformed and sometimes significantly altered the mythological material it received from Greece, Ovid found in the dream god a figure worth describing carefully. The Metamorphosis is a poem of transformations, of forms changing into other forms, of the boundary between one shape and another being crossed. The title announces Morphe as its central concern, and within that poem, among hundreds of mythological episodes, the description of Hypnos and his sons and the singling out of Morpheus is one of the most precise and atmospherically complete passages Ovid produced. He is writing late. He is writing into a tradition that is already very old by his time. The worship of the Olympian gods and of the older powers like Nyx and Hypnos, from whom the Olympians descended, or beside whom they stood, had been practiced for many centuries before Ovid set his stylus to wax and began drafting the Metamorphoses. The Iamata stones at Epidaurus, which would be inscribed with the records of dream healings at the sanctuary of Asclepius, were accumulating across a period that overlapped with and extended beyond Ovid's lifetime. The tradition of understanding dreams as sites of divine communication, as places where the dead spoke to the living, where gods delivered instructions, where the boundary between the human world and the divine one became permeable in the specific vulnerability of sleep, was not something Ovid invented. He inherited it. He shaped it in the way that poets shape material they receive, and he passed it forward. And the cave, as he describes it, has a quality of stillness that is almost architectural. The mountain hollow, the sunlight excluded, the poppies at the entrance, the black ebony bed, the sons gathered around their father in the dark. It is a description of a place so specifically constructed for the purpose it serves that the imagined space itself becomes a kind of argument. The cave is the shape of what it contains, a place without light, without sound beyond the near silent movement of dream spirits departing, without the ordinary markers of time that make wakefulness feel oriented. This is the right architecture for a figure whose work takes place in the unstructured interior of a sleeping mind. Hypnos on his bed, surrounded by his sons, turning to select the one with the steadiest hands for human likeness. It is an image of craft and delegation, of a specialized ability recognized and deployed with care. The 1,000 sons are there. They each have their particular gifts and their particular purposes, but for the delicate work, for the errand that requires a figure so precise that grief will respond to it, and recognition will confirm it, and a dreamer will reach toward it with the specific reaching that belongs to love. For that work, the choice is always the same: Morpheus, the one whose name means form, the one whose function is to take the raw and shapeless material of a sleeping mind and give it the outline of a face, a voice, a body moving through a dream with the particular walk of someone the dreamer knows. The one who stands in the dark before a sleeping consciousness like a craftsman at a table, assembling components that have been practiced for a very long time until the construction is complete and the figure can stand on its own, holding nothing and giving nothing away. The noun Morphus sits inside his name the way a function sits inside a tool. It is there because it was always there, because the figure needed a name, and the name needed to say something true about what the figure did, and in the language that gave him his name, Morphe was the word that said exactly that: form, shape, the visible arrangement of qualities that makes a thing recognizable as itself. From that noun, down through the centuries and across the languages that carried it westward and northward, and eventually into the mouths of people speaking English in the present day, the root kept traveling. It kept being useful. Well, it kept being attached to new words that needed it, because the concept it described, the form of a thing, the question of shape, the difference between something that has a recognizable outline and something that does not, kept recurring in new contexts that required new vocabulary but reached for the same old root: morphology, metamorphosis, amorphous, and morphine. But that carries its own history, its own connection to the poppy and the cave and the sleep that Morpheus governed. A history that runs from Ovid's poppies nodding at the cave's entrance all the way to a pharmacist's workbench in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century, when the active compound of the poppy was first isolated and given a name, and the name that was chosen was the gods. For now, though, the cave is still. The poppies are still. On his black ebony bed, Hypnos rests among his sons, and among his sons the one who carries Morphe in his name waits in the particular patience of a craftsman between errands, not idle, exactly, but unhurried, because the work will come when the work comes, and when it does, the hands will be steady, and the construction will be sound, and somewhere in the night a sleeper will believe, with their whole sleeping self, that the figure standing before them is someone they have always known. Modern speakers use words with that root in them every day, in contexts that could not have been imagined in the cave where the name was first attached to the figure. Biology courses teach morphology. Literary scholars discuss metamorphosis. Scientists describe amorphous structures. The noun travels forward through every use of it, carrying its ancient association quietly and invisibly, the way a river carries dissolved minerals from the mountains, where it rose all the way to the sea, where it ends, arriving unannounced, changing nothing on the surface, changing everything in the chemistry of the water. The dream god gave the root his name, or the root gave the dream god his, or both are simply expressions of the same underlying fact, that the concept of form, of shape, of the visible arrangement that makes a thing what it is, was understood in the ancient Greek tradition as a power significant enough to personify, and the personification that resulted was a figure in a cave in the dark, with the steadiest hands among all the sons of sleep, assembling human likenesses with such care that a dreaming mind could not detect the join between the figure it was seeing and the person it had loved while waking. The word morphe continues. It continues in morphology, and in metamorphosis, and in amorphous, and in the names of the compounds, and the disciplines, and the systems that reached for it when they needed to say something about form, and found it waiting there, old and precise, and exactly right for the purpose. The speakers who use it do not think of the cave. They do not think of the black ebony bed, or the poppy stems, or the figure assembling itself in the dark to stand at the edge of a sleeping person's consciousness. They simply use the word the way words are used, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without knowing the particular darkness the root traveled through on its way to them. The connection persists, quiet and invisible and long, stretched across the full length of time between that ancient cave and the present moment, between the God who gave form to the figures in a dream and every word that carries his root into a mouth that has never heard his name. At nightfall, from a single opening in the earth, they rose, not one or two, but a great number, more than any single account agrees on, though all accounts agree the number was vast. Some sources hold they were hundreds, others hold they were thousands. What every telling shares is the quality of the motion, the way they emerged together at the hour when the last of the day had finally left the sky, spreading outward from one dark aperture into the wider dark of the world, each figure carrying its particular gift or its particular deception toward a shore it had already been assigned. This was how the nights of the ancient world were populated, according to the tradition that placed these figures at the heart of what happens to sleeping minds. This was how the one-eyed snipe moved. The cave they came from was not precisely located in most sources. What the tradition preserves is its quality, its depth, its stillness, the particular weight of air inside a place where sunlight has never reached and never will. The entrance was said to grow poppies. The interior held Hypnos, the god of sleep himself, on his black ebony bed in the darkest part of the hollow, surrounded on all sides by the dreams he had fathered, each of which waited in its own form for the night that would require it. When darkness settled over the world, and the first of the sleeping minds began to soften and go quiet, the One-Neri did not hesitate. They moved upward through the cave mouth and outward across the sky, the way a roost of bats pours out at dusk, not disordered, not frantic, but in a single sustained outward motion that had no center and no leading edge, only the direction of dispersal and the certainty of destination. Different figures going different ways, different shores, different rooms, different sleepers waiting, though none of them knew they were waiting, in the particular unguarded openness of sleep. Hesiod, composing the Theogony in approximately the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, placed the One-Neri among the children of Nyx, the goddess of night herself, one of the oldest figures in the Greek cosmological order, a deity who predated the Olympians, and whom even Zeus, in some accounts, was careful not to offend. In the Theogony's genealogical lines, the children of Nyx form a catalog not of minor figures, but of fundamental forces. Death is among them, fate is among them, strife, deceit, old age, the Hesperides, and alongside these, the dreams. What this placement tells the reader is something about the status of the One-Neri within Greek thought. They were not decorative, they were not secondary. They were listed in the same breath as death and fate, because the tradition understood them as belonging to the same order of existence, not gods who chose to involve themselves in mortal affairs from time to time, but powers woven into the structure of things from the moment the structure existed. Dream was not something that happened to mortals. Dream was a fundamental feature of the world, as old as night, as old as the forces that preceded the gods of Olympus. Nyx herself is worth pausing on, because the lineage the One-Neri carry through her is one that opens backward into a kind of primordial depth that the later, more familiar mythology of Mount Olympus does not quite reach. In the Greek cosmogony, night was among the first things that existed, not a personification of darkness added after the world was made, but one of the original conditions out of which everything else emerged. She moved through the cosmos with an authority that the tradition consistently described as untouchable. Homer, in the Iliad, preserves an account in which Hypnos, having assisted Hera in a scheme against Zeus, flees his father's anger and takes refuge with his mother Nyx, and Zeus, unwilling to disturb her, relents. The dream god's father could find shelter from the king of the gods behind his grandmother. This is not a minor detail. It is the tradition's way of encoding how old this family was, how deep the roots ran, how far back they went before the world had the shape that mortals of the classical period recognized and named. From Nyx, the line descended through Hypnos to the One-Neri, and among the Waniroi there were named figures, distinct from the mass of the unnamed thousands, individuated by their particular specializations, each of them responsible for a different kind of dream content. Morpheus, whose craft with human likeness the tradition had already established, was the foremost, but the named figures extended further into territory that covered the full range of what a sleeping mind might encounter. Phoebetor was among them. His name derived directly from the Greek phobos, fear, and his domain was the animal. Parsus assembled the precise replication of a human face and voice. Phobetor took on the forms of beasts, the shape of a horse, a serpent, a great bird, whatever creature would arrive in the dream with the specific weight of something that could not be argued with. The experience of being confronted in a dream by an animal that cannot be reasoned away, by something that moves on instinct and has no language to address, this was understood in the tradition as Phobetor's work. His appearances in ancient sources are fewer than Morpheus's, his individual stories less elaborated, but his function is clear and specific, and the class of dream he produced was real enough in ancient experience that the tradition needed a named figure to account for it. There was also Phantasos, whose specialty the tradition placed in another register again, where Morpheus reproduced the human and Phobetor the animal. Phantasos took the forms of the inanimate world, earth, stone, water, the textures and surfaces of things that had never been alive. His name gave the later world the word that still carries his lineage, fantasy, phantom, the whole conceptual range of things seen but not substantive. Ovid names all three, Morpheus, Phobetor, Phantasos, in the passage of the Metamorphoses where Hypnos selects from among his thousands the son most suited for a particular errand, and in naming them he preserves the ancient tripartite division, human forms, animal forms, and the forms of the world itself. Together, the three covered the terrain of dreamed experience completely, any figure a sleeper might encounter, any landscape they might inhabit, any presence they might feel without seeing, belonged in one category or another. The 1,000 unnamed figures filled in the rest, the ordinary fabric of ordinary nights, the dreams that were not prophetic and not significant and not sent by any god, that simply moved through a sleeping mind and left without a trace. The question of which dreams came from which source, the god who sent them, the gate they passed through, was not a casual one in the ancient tradition. It had a specific geography. Both Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid, composed several centuries apart, describe two gates standing at the threshold of the underworld through which dreams departed on their way to sleeping mortals. One gate was made of polished horn, one was made of carved ivory. They stood somewhere in the deep architecture of the world below, far from sunlight, far from the noise of the living world, and through them all dreams passed on their way upward into the dark rooms of the sleeping. The difference between the gates was not visible from the outside. A dream could not be examined at its gate to determine which threshold it had crossed. It arrived in the sleeping mind, and the sleeper received it, and only afterward, in the careful work of interpretation, might it be possible to determine where it had come from. Through the gate of horn passed dreams that were true. These were the dreams that carried genuine prophecy, genuine news, genuine images of what had happened or what would happen, the kind of dream that when morning came and the dreamer lay still and turned it over, pointed accurately at something real. Through the gate of ivory passed the other kind. These were not distinguished by their appearance within the dream. A false dream from the gate of ivory was not transparent, did not announce itself as deception, did not fail to convince. It arrived with the same authority as a true dream, with the same clarity of detail, the same emotional weight, the same quality of seeming to matter. The ivory gate produced perfect counterfeits, dreams that felt prophetic, that felt significant, that felt like the kind of dream worth interpreting, but that meant nothing, or that meant the opposite of what they seemed to say, or that came from no divine source at all, and corresponded to nothing in the world outside the sleeping mind. The distinction between horn and ivory was not visible to the dreamer. It was a theological fact about the dream's origin that the dreamer could not determine by looking. Penelope, in the Odyssey, speaks of this explicitly. Lying in her darkened room in Ithaca after years of waiting, she describes the two gates to a stranger she does not yet recognize as her own husband, working through the question with a steadiness that belongs to someone who has spent a long time learning to live with uncertainty. The dream she has just received of an eagle descending and killing geese and speaking to her in a human voice could be true prophecy, or it could be the elaborate nothing of the ivory gate. She does not know. She cannot know. She describes both gates, both possibilities, with the same calm tone, as though the question of which threshold her dream has crossed is one she has long since made her peace with, not being able to answer. This is not a small passage in Homer. It is a moment in which the poem pauses to let a character speak directly about the experience of living inside a system where meaningful communication from the divine was genuinely believed to arrive through sleep, but where that communication was indistinguishable from its own false counterpart, and where the only honest response to any single dream was a careful, suspended uncertainty. The cave from which the Wanryu departed each night was understood, in most sources, to be located somewhere in or near the underworld, that part of the ancient cosmological map that lay below the world of the living, in the region the Greeks called Erebus, which was also one of the primordial entities, a figure of deep darkness that the Theogony placed among the very first things to exist. This is worth noting simply as geography. In the Greek tradition, the place where dreams originated was not far from the place where the dead went. Hypnos and his twin brother Thanatos shared a dwelling in this region, the two of them inseparable in the ancient sources, paired in ancient poetry and in ancient art as companion forces that together governed the transition between consciousness and its absence. Thanatos was death. Hypnos was sleep. Their twinship was not metaphorical or decorative. It encoded a specific Greek understanding of what sleep was, not a temporary recovery from waking life, but a genuine threshold crossing, a genuine passage into a different order of being, different from death in degree and in duration, but not different in kind. Every night that a mortal lay down and surrendered consciousness was, in this understanding, a small and reversible crossing of the same boundary that Thanatos governed permanently. The Euphronios crater, a large painted ceramic vessel created around 515 BCE and considered one of the finest surviving examples of Athenian red figure pottery, depicts the moment from Homer's Iliad when Hypnos and Thanatos carry the body of the slain hero Sarpedon from the battlefield at Troy. The image is specific and considered. Two winged figures, their faces composed and unhurried, their wings dark against the background, bearing a human body between them, with the careful attention of figures who have performed this work before and will perform it again and are in no particular hurry about it. What the painting renders is not grief and not violence. It renders a transition, the moment when a mortal passes from one state to another, attended by the forces the tradition assigned to that passage. Hypnos is on one side, Thanatos is on the other. Between them is the dead man, and the figures who carry him are calm because this is what they do, because this is what they have always done, because the world has always had this moment in it and always will. Looking at that image, even across the distance of 25 centuries, something about its composition communicates directly. The unhurried quality of the two figures, their symmetry, the weight of what they carry, held without strain. The tradition understood sleep and death as a pair. It understood the dreaming mind as something that crossed, each night, into a territory that was adjacent to the one from which no one returned, and the cave from which the Wanneroi rose was located there, in that adjacency. This is not a dark reading of the tradition. It is simply the cosmological geography of the ancient Greek world, described as carefully as the location of Olympus or the course of the river Styx. The dreams that came to sleeping mortals originated in the same region as the dead. They traveled upward through the night and arrived at sleeping heads, and the sleeper received them in the same state of reduced consciousness that made them, temporarily, something closer to their own eventual condition than they were during the day. Morning came and reversed the process. But the region where the dreams had formed remained. The idea that the dreams rising from that region could be sorted into true and false by the gate they passed through adds a further layer to the geography. The two gates were not merely a convenient narrative device for explaining how dreams worked. They were a structure the tradition took seriously enough to preserve across multiple authors, multiple centuries, and multiple literary forms. Homer places them in the Odyssey, in the voice of Penelope. Virgil places them in the Aeneid, at the conclusion of his underworld sequence, when Aeneas and the Sibyl depart the realm of the dead through the Ivory Gate, a passage that has occupied scholars for a very long time, because the tradition associates the Ivory Gate with false dreams, and it is unclear what it means that the heroes leave through it. Virgil does not explain. He describes the two gates, describes which one they use, and continues. The ambiguity is left standing. One reading suggests that the living cannot pass through the Horn Gate, that true dreams can only leave through the Gate of Horn, and the living who have visited the dead must leave through the other. Another reading holds that the whole vision Aeneas received in the underworld was Virgil's way of marking it as something between truth and constructed meaning, not false, but not the unmediated truth the Horn Gate carried. The argument has not been resolved. It may not be resolvable. The tradition left the question open, and the tradition's silences are often as interesting as what it says. What both gates shared was their physical quality in the ancient imagination. Neither polished horn nor carved ivory was luminous. Neither would catch light in the dark of the underworld, because there was no light there to catch. The Horn Gate was described as translucent, that quality of horn when it has been worked thin enough that shapes can be seen dimly through it, though not clearly. The Ivory Gate was white and smooth and perfectly opaque. Through one of them, in the dark, truth slipped upward every night. Through the other, perfect and convincing untruths followed the same path. They traveled the same route, through the same dark to the same sleeping minds, and arrived indistinguishable. This is one of the things the tradition held about the dream world, that it could not be taken at face value, that it required interpretation, that its relationship to the waking world was neither transparent nor meaningless, but something more carefully calibrated than either, a real mode of communication that was also consistently unreliable in ways that could not be anticipated from inside the dream itself. The Wanneroi, who carried these dreams, true and false alike, were not, in the tradition, moral agents responsible for the quality of what they delivered. They were carriers. The content of a dream was determined by its source, which god had sent it, or whether any god had sent it at all, or whether it had arisen from some other mechanism entirely. Artemidorus, writing his comprehensive dream interpretation manual in the 2nd century of the Common Era, would spend considerable effort distinguishing between the kinds of dreams that carried meaningful content and the kinds that did not, between the once roi in the prophetic sense and the anhypnia that simply reflected the bodily or emotional state of the sleeper, arising from no divine source and pointing to nothing outside the sleeper's own condition. But the figures who traveled each night from the cave of Hypnos were not responsible for sorting their own kind. They moved through the dark with what they had been assigned to carry, arrived at the sleeping mind, and deposited it, and departed. The interpretation was the work of the living, done in daylight, after the dream had already gone. Among the thousands of unnamed figures rising each night, the named ones carried their particular specializations with the same impersonal consistency. Phobator arrived in the form of a beast, and left behind the experience of having confronted something that could not be reasoned with. This was not a punishment. It was not a divine expression of displeasure. It was simply the form his gift took, the particular shape his craft produced, the way a blacksmith's work always has the character of iron in it, whatever specific thing is being made. That the dreams he brought were unpleasant, that they left the sleeper with the residue of fear on waking, was a feature of his domain, not a statement about the dreamer who received them. The tradition did not hold that bad dreams were sent to bad people. The tradition held that dreams came from a place beyond the sleeper's control, passed through gates the sleeper could not see, arrived from sources the sleeper could not verify, and required careful attention in the morning, regardless of whether the experience had been comfortable. This is, in its own way, a remarkably complete system. It accounted for every kind of dream a mortal might have, the prophetic dream that warned of what was coming, the healing dream that arrived in a sacred precinct after ritual preparation, the frightening dream that left no residue of meaning, the vivid dream of a known face that seemed more real than waking life. It assigned each type to a source, placed each source in a specific cosmological location, and gave the whole structure a geography that could be mapped, at least in principle, onto the larger map of the Greek world. The cave was in the underworld. The gate stood at its threshold. The Wanoiroi rose each nightfall and dispersed. The sleepers lay waiting in their darkened rooms across every shore, and the figures arrived, and the morning came, and the work of interpretation began again. The relationship between the Wanoiroi and the larger family of night deserves one more look, because the tradition's insistence on placing dream among the primordial forces had a specific consequence for how mortals were expected to receive what dreams brought them. If dream was as old as death and fate, if it had been woven into the structure of the world at the same moment those forces were woven in, then the communication it carried was not a casual supplement to waking life. It was part of the same fabric. A significant dream was not the sleeping mind producing entertainment. It was the structure of the world speaking through a channel it had possessed since before the gods of Olympus existed. The response this required was proportionate. A dreamer who received something that felt significant had not simply had an interesting night. They had received a communication from something that was older than the gods they prayed to, that originated in the same darkness from which the world had been assembled, that traveled through the same geography as the dead on their way to whatever came after. To treat such a thing with anything less than careful attention would have been, in the ancient understanding, a kind of failure of perception, a refusal to notice what the world was actually doing. The ancient Greek world contained many mechanisms for the divine to communicate with the mortal, and most of them were difficult, ambiguous, and required interpretation by specialists. The oracle at Delphi spoke in riddles. The flight of birds required augurs trained to read it. The entrails of sacrificed animals had to be examined by those who knew what to look for. Dreams were, in this context, the most personal of the channels, the one that arrived directly, without the mediation of priests or oracles, in the most private space available to a mortal, the interior of their own sleeping mind. The one boy crossed whatever distance separated the cave of their father from the room where the dreamer lay, and they delivered their content without interpreter or intermediary directly to the mind that was waiting for it. And every night the process began again. The last light left the sky. The cave mouth exhaled its thousands into the spreading dark. The world's sleeping population, from the shores of Greece to the edges of whatever the Greek imagination placed at the world's far reaches, lay in their darkened rooms, and the dream figures moved outward from their source toward each of them, carrying human faces and animal forms, and the textures of stone and water, carrying the news of the dead, and the forecasts of the future, and the ordinary residue of the previous day's worries. All of it traveling through the same, dark toward the same undifferentiated destination of closed eyes and quieted minds. Whether any given sleeper would receive something that came from the horn gate or something that came from the ivory gate was not determined by anything the sleeper had done or not done, at least in the tradition's general frame. The gates stood in the dark at the edge of the underworld, and they stood without labels. Neither was marked, neither announced itself. The polished horn gate stood beside the smooth ivory one, and through each of them, every night, dreams passed in both directions. If dreams have directions, if the movement of a figure from a cave to a sleeping mind can be said to have an orientation in space, the way a bird in flight has one, there is something worth staying with in that image. Two gates standing in a darkness so complete that the difference between them is invisible, each one the passage through which a different kind of communication arrives, and no way from the outside to tell them apart. The dreamer waking in the morning with the vivid residue of something important had received their dream through one of those thresholds. They lay still. They turned the images over. They waited to see whether what they had been given would clarify itself in daylight, whether the story it seemed to tell would correspond to anything that happened in the waking world, whether the figure that had stood before them in sleep would resolve in retrospect into something sent by a god through the true gate, or something issued from the other one with the same convincing weight. The gates stood in the dark at the edge of the underworld, neither of them labeled, neither of them distinguishable by anything a waking mind could name, simply waiting for the next night's dreams to find their way through. True ones through the one, false ones through the other, and the world above unable, in any given case, to say with certainty which was which. Iris arrives at the entrance of the cave without announcement. She is, by her nature, impossible to miss, a figure wrapped in the spectrum of every color light can make. Trailing behind her, the faint luminous arch of a rainbow that has followed her down through layers of cloud and cold air, and the particular darkness that gathers above places where no sun reaches. Her light falls on the mouth of the cave, the way lamplight falls on the entrance to a room that has been kept closed for a long time. The poppies at the threshold nod very slightly in the disturbance her arrival makes. Everything else holds still. The cave itself, as Ovid describes it in Book 11 of his Metamorphoses, is set within a hollow mountain, a place where the rock has been scooped out over ages into a vast interior silence. Sunlight has never touched the deeper chambers. No wind moves through the inner passages. The river Lethe flows through the mountain's heart, and the water that passes over those smooth stones makes no sound, or rather, it makes a sound that is itself a form of quiet, a low continuous murmur that functions in the cave the way silence functions everywhere else, filling the ear just enough that there is nothing left for thought to hold. Poppies and other drowsing herbs grow thick at the entrance, and their scent travels inward along the still air, layer over layer, until the whole interior is saturated with it, the way a room fills slowly with the smell of something burning in the next room. Pervasive, unhurried, and by the time one notices it, already everywhere. Iris stands at the threshold and does not go further than she must. The brightness she carries is not welcome here, and she appears to know it. Hypnos, the god of sleep, lies on a bed of black ebony in the cave's deepest chamber, surrounded by his sons, who shift and drift around him in the dark like shapes seen through water. The bed is draped in dark coverings. The god himself, in Ovid's telling, is barely present, present the way a person who has been asleep for a very long time becomes more absence than body, a form from which all active quality has withdrawn and left only weight and warmth and the slow rise and fall of breath. His sons surround him in their hundreds, shapes that carry every kind of dream, the strange, the urgent, the false, the true, the barely remembered, the one that comes back on the same night every year without explanation. Among them, Iris is looking for one in particular. She calls out for Morpheus. The name carries in the cave, the way sound carries in a space where it is unexpected, more distinctly than it would in a noisy place, landing on silence and resting there. She has been sent by the goddess Juno, who has a specific task and requires a specific skill. Alcyone, the wife of King Ceyx, is in Trachis, and she is praying. She has been praying for some time, offering her petitions to Juno on her husband's behalf, asking the goddess to keep him safe on the voyage he has undertaken to see him home to her. Juno knows what Alcyone does not. Ceyx is dead. He drowned in a storm at sea, and his body is somewhere in the water, and the prayers being offered for his safe return are being offered to a future that no longer exists. Juno has decided that Alcyone must be told, and the telling must be done in a particular way, in the only language that can carry news of this kind to a woman in her sleep. It must be done in a dream, by a figure she will believe completely. This is what Morpheus is for. The story of Ceyx and Alcyone is the single surviving ancient narrative in which Morpheus takes an active and extended dramatic role. It is preserved in Ovid's Metamorphoses, written around the turn of the 1st century CE, and the telling is long and careful, and contains within it some of the most precisely observed writing about sleep and dreaming that survives from the ancient world. Ovid is a poet who pays attention to sensory detail, not merely what things mean, but what they look like, what they smell like, what they sound like, or in this case, what they notably fail to sound like. His description of the cave of Hypnos is not ornamentation. It is the setting for an act that requires absolute stillness, absolute darkness, and a craftsman whose work consists entirely in the construction of convincing appearances. Morpheus rises from among his brothers. What the tradition holds about this particular figure is that his skill is different in kind from what the others offer. Where his brothers can take the forms of animals, of landscapes, of nameless presences, Morpheus works specifically in the form of human beings, known human beings, specific people whose posture and voice and manner of moving through a room the dreamer carries in their body as a form of intimate knowledge. This is delicate work. The human figure is the most deeply familiar thing a person carries in their mind. A dreamer will accept almost any landscape without question, will walk through impossible geography without hesitation, will stand in a room that is also somehow a forest without pausing to notice the strangeness. But a human face known well and deeply is a different matter. The dreamer's mind holds the original in extraordinary detail, the specific quality of a certain person's voice, the way that person's weight shifts when they are choosing words carefully, the particular angle of their head when they are listening, the way the skin around their eyes moves when something has made them sad. Morpheus must reproduce all of this. He must reproduce it well enough that even within the heightened sensitivity of a grieving mind, nothing triggers the dreamer's recognition that what they are seeing is not the person they love, but a construction. Ovid credits him with being the most skilled among all the sons of Hypnos at exactly this work, at the reproduction of human gait, human voice, human dress, human gesture. Among the hundreds or thousands of dream figures who rise from this cave each night and disperse across the world, Morpheus is the one sent when the dream must carry a human form that will bear sustained scrutiny. He takes the form of Caecus. What this requires, in the logic of the myth, is a close attention to the specific quality of a man who has drowned. Caecus is not merely dead. He is dead in a particular way, by a particular means, and his body has been in the sea. Morpheus must carry into Alcyone's dream not the Saix who sailed away from her, not the living man in his traveling clothes, his face warm with the expectation of return, but the Saix who will not be coming back. The wet hair, the particular pallor of skin that has been in cold water, the face with its animation gone, with the quality of presence that makes a living face something more than its features drained away, and what remains only the features themselves, the structure, the shape, without the person inside it. Morpheus takes all of this and lifts it on, the way a performer settles into a role before stepping in front of an audience, except that the audience is one person, asleep, completely undefended, with no way to leave the theater. Alcyone is dreaming. She is in Trachis, in the rooms she and CX share, and the night around her is deep and ordinary, and she is asleep the way a person sleeps who has been waiting for a long time. The worry for a traveling spouse does not announce itself clearly during waking hours, but lives in the body at a low continuous level, and at night, when there is nothing to occupy the mind, it surfaces. She has been dreaming, perhaps, the kinds of dreams that waiting produces. The ship arriving, the familiar voice in the next room, the ordinary restored. Then Morpheus enters the dream, wearing the form of her husband. Ovid's account of what follows is among the quietest and most interior passages in the Metamorphoses. There is no action in the conventional sense. A figure stands before a sleeping woman. It speaks. The woman responds in her sleep, her face moving through recognition, and then grief, her hands reaching towards something that is not there, and then finding the absence. The figure tells her what happened. It tells her, with the specific knowledge of someone who was there, the details of the storm, the moment the ship went under, the end of the night Caecus had. It speaks in Caecus's voice. It speaks with the particular quality of address that belongs to Caecus, and no one else, the way the real man spoke to this specific woman, which is different from how he spoke to anyone else, because long intimacy produces a private language of tone and reference that is not available to anyone outside the relationship. Morpheus has all of this. This is what the tradition says he can do. Alcyone weeps in her sleep. She reaches toward the figure, and her hand finds nothing. She speaks to it, and the words she finds are the words of someone who has understood, at the level below reason where grief actually lives, that the person they love is gone. The dream does not soften the news. It does not offer comfort beyond the fact of the telling itself, beyond the fact that within the dream she has seen him once more, has heard the voice once more, knows what she needs to know, even though knowing it is the thing that will break the careful waiting she has been maintaining since the ship left. She wakes while it is still dark. The waking after a dream like that has its own particular quality. The moment between sleep and full consciousness, when the dream still has its reality, when the figure she has just spoken to is still present in the room, in a way, and the knowledge she has received is present in the body before the mind has organized it into thought. She lies still, as Ovid describes her, in the kind of stillness that follows when the body is not yet sure what to do with what the night has brought. Then, the understanding settles into its full weight. She rises before dawn and goes to the shore, to the place where she last watched Sikhs depart, and she stands there and looks at the water that has kept him. This is the myth at the threshold of its ending. In the logic of Ovid's telling, what happens next belongs to the specific kind of transformation that characterizes the metamorphoses, the moment when grief reaches a pitch that the human form cannot sustain, and the gods who have been watching intervene in the only way available to them. The gods of the ancient Greek and Roman traditions are not, generally, in the business of reversing death. The boundary between the living and the dead is one of the most consistently maintained structures in the ancient mythological world. Syrinx cannot be restored to life in the form he had, but the gods can make of the grief something other than simple ending, and what they make here is birds. Alcyone, standing at the shore, sees something in the water, a body, floating on the surface, carried by the current toward the place where she stands. She recognizes it as her husband's. Ovid describes the moment with restraint. What she sees, the recognition, the understanding, settling completely, now over what the dream had already told her. And then, as she is leaning out over the water, something happens to her body that removes her from the category of women standing at shores. The gods transform her. She becomes a halcyon bird, a kingfisher. In later identification, though the ancient halcyon was its own creature, its identity debated in the tradition, she calls out in the voice she now has, a cry that has in it everything the human voice was carrying a moment before. She flies over the water toward the floating form of Sex, and where she reaches him, the gods transform him too, two birds on the winter sea. This is where the story arrives, and it is worth resting with what the transformation does to the grief, not replacing it, not resolving it in the way resolutions are expected to work, but changing its form in the same way a metamorphosis changes the form of the person. The love that existed between CX and Alcyone is not argued away or consoled into silence. It is allowed to continue, but in a different shape, between two creatures who now share the water between them instead of the rooms they shared before, who now exist together in a different way than they existed together when they were king and queen of Trachis, and the future was still open ahead of them. The name Alcyone carries forward in a particular way. Ancient writers held that the halcyon bird nested on the sea in winter, that the female bird built her nest on the surface of the water and brooded over her eggs for a period of roughly 2 weeks in the coldest part of the year, and that during this period the sea was held calm by divine intervention. The explanation for the calm was the birds themselves. The halcyon's nesting period required quiet water, and because Alcyon had become the halcyon, the sea that had killed Sikhs was held to stillness during the time her descendant birds nested on it. The Latin phrase Alcyona dies, the halcyon days, entered the tradition as the name for this period of settled winter weather, this pause in the storms, this interval of unusual calm on water that would, before and after, resume its ordinary violence. The phrase carries on. It passes from the Latin into languages that would not be spoken for centuries after Ovid set it down. The English expression, the halcyon days, meaning a time of peace, of settled happiness, of a particular brightness that one recognizes later as having been exceptional, carries inside it, without advertising the fact, the myth of a woman who stood at a shore in the dark before dawn and looked at the water that had taken her husband. The calm of those days is named for her grief, and for the birds, and for the sea that pauses each winter in a period of stillness that the tradition said she earned. But this is where Morpheus's role in the story deserves its own attention, because it is easy for the drama of the transformation to draw the eye away from the figure who performed the earliest and most difficult act in the sequence. Juno needed Alcyone to know. This was the beginning of the story's machinery. A woman was praying to a goddess on behalf of a man who was already dead, and the prayers themselves had become a kind of wrong, a continuation of hope in a situation where hope no longer had an object. Juno, who in this myth is not a figure of cruelty, but of a more complicated mercy, sends Iris to the cave of Hypnos, specifically because there is no other way to deliver the news that will not be worse than the dream. A messenger arriving at the door in daylight, carrying the news in human words, is one kind of wound. A dream in which Alcyone has one last encounter with her husband, in which he tells her himself, in his own voice, with the intimate authority that belongs only to someone who was there and who knows her well enough to speak to her this way. This is a different kind of knowing. It does not soften the fact, but it gives the fact its proper form. This is the mercy that Morpheus performs, and it is worth noting that the tradition frames it this way, as a performance of skill in the service of something that is, at its deepest level, an act of witness. Morpheus does not go to Alcyone to deceive her about the outcome. He goes to tell her the truth. The form is false. The figure standing in the dream is not Seek's, but the content it delivers is true, and the manner of delivery is the most faithful reproduction of the real man that any dream could offer. This is a distinction the ancient world held with care. The gate of horn and the gate of ivory stood in the tradition precisely because the ancient imagination understood that not all dreams were equally trustworthy, that some carried genuine information and some carried constructions designed to mislead. The dream of Ceyx comes through one gate and not the other. Its form is fabricated, its truth is not. Morpheus returns to the cave when his task is complete. What the myth does not describe is the return, the moment when the form of Ceyx is set aside, when the wet hair and the gray skin and the particular slackness of that face are removed, and what remains is the dream figure itself, whatever that is, whatever Morpheus is, when he is not wearing a specific human form. The tradition is not interested in this, and there is something fitting in that. Morpheus is defined entirely by his capacity for likeness. What he is apart from the figures he inhabits is not a question the ancient writers chose to answer, possibly because the question itself does not have a satisfying answer within the logic of a tradition that defines his nature through what he can become rather than what he is. The cave receives him back into its silence. Hypnos lies on his black ebony bed. The poppies nod at the entrance. The river moves through the mountain's heart, without sound, or with a sound that is itself indistinguishable from silence. The hundreds of other dream figures drift in the dark, and the night continues, and across the world in many rooms, people are asleep, and the dreams that visit them are still moving in their particular directions, carrying their particular cargo toward particular sleeping minds. Some of the cargo is true, some of it is not. The tradition holds that this was always the way of it, that this uncertainty was built into the architecture from the beginning, and that the best a sleeping person could do was to receive what the night brought, and then, in the morning, try to read it carefully. Ovid, composing this passage in his study in Rome, was a writer who had spent his life attending to transformation, to the specific mechanism by which one form becomes another, and what is preserved through the change, and what is lost. The Metamorphoses is the great work of that attention, and the myth of Ceyx and Alcyone sits within it as one of the more quietly devastating examples, because the transformation at the end of the story does not restore anything. It does not return the living Ceyx to the rooms in Trachis where Alcyone waited. It does not give her back the future they were supposed to share. It gives her something adjacent to that, a companionship in a different form, continued existence on the same water that separated them, the ability to be near the things she loves, even though the terms of nearness have changed entirely. The birds on the water persist in the imagination long after the story ends, which is perhaps why the story has persisted as long as it has. There is something in the image that the myth clearly understood. Two small forms on a gray winter sea, the water calm around them, the storm suspended above them in deference to a pair of birds that carry in their transformed bodies everything that remained of a marriage that began in a city in Trachis and ended in a storm at sea, and then continued differently, on the surface of the same water that had swallowed one of them whole. Alcyone flies. Ceyx is beside her. The halcyon days hold the weather steady above them, and the sea beneath them, for now, has forgotten how to be the thing that separates people from the ones they were sailing toward. Morpheus has been and gone. His task in the story is finished before the transformation, before the shore, before the birds. He enters the dream, performs the work, delivers what he has been sent to deliver, and withdraws. He is not present for the ending of the story he set in motion. This is the nature of his function. He delivers the dream and then returns to the cave, and what the dreamer does with what they have received is not his concern. The dream he wove for Alcyone gave her the knowledge she needed to stand at that shore in the right way, with the right understanding already fully in her body, so that when she saw the form in the water, she recognized it without the need to be told again. This is perhaps the most precise way to understand what Morpheus offers within the logic of the myth. He does not manufacture comfort. He does not construct dreams that tell the dreamer what they wish were true. He constructs a human form convincingly enough to deliver the truth in the voice and manner of the person the truth belongs to. His craft is in the service of accurate transmission. The figure he builds is false. The message it carries is not. And the dreamer, waking in the dark, carries the message forward into the morning and into the rest of her life, which will be shorter and stranger, and also in the particular way of transformation stories will last much longer than it would have if the gods had left her to ordinary mortality. The halcyon days are still named for her. This is the quiet persistence of the myth, that its central term, the name of the woman who stood at the shore and then became a bird, has outlived the cultural context that produced it by 2,000 years and more, and now lives in ordinary speech in languages that did not exist when Ovid set the story down. Someone uses the phrase on a Thursday afternoon in a conversation about a particular summer they remember, a period of unusual calm and happiness that they recognized even then as something worth noticing, and the word they reach for, halcyon. The halcyon days is the word that carries inside it a drowned king and a grieving wife, and a dream figure wearing the pallor of a man the sea had taken, standing at the edge of a sleeping woman's bed in the darkness of a night in Trachis, speaking the truth in the voice she knew best. The cave is quiet again. Iris has gone, her rainbow trailing back up through the layers of air between the cave's entrance and the sky above it, the brightness receding until the poppies are in their ordinary darkness, and the silence is complete and uninterrupted, and the only sound is the river moving through the stone. Tupno sleeps. His sons move around him in the dark. The cave holds what it always holds, the accumulated weight of every dream that has risen from it and gone outward into the world, carrying their particular cargo, and the patience of a place that knows the work is not done, that there are still many hours of night remaining, and that across the world the sleeping minds are still there, still waiting, still in need of whatever the night has decided to send them. Somewhere on the winter sea, two birds rest on calm water. The waves do not rise. The storms that were building above the horizon have paused in their building, held back by whatever agreement the tradition says was made on behalf of these birds, on behalf of the nesting and the eggs and the brief interval of peace that Alcyon's name now guarantees each winter. The water is gray and flat and reflects nothing because the sky above it is gray too, and the two small forms on the surface are still the way things are still when they have arrived somewhere and are not yet preparing to leave. The sea does not remember, in this telling, how to be violent. It has set the violence aside for now. For now, the water is simply water, and the birds are simply on it, and the name Alcyon rests quietly in the air above them, the ancient word for a particular kind of winter calm that the world still recognizes, even now, even in languages that have never heard the myth that gave it its meaning. The stone floor of the Abaton at Epidaurus was cold, not cold in the way that a night breeze is cold, or the way a stone wall is cold when a hand brushes it in passing, cold in the way that stone is cold when it has not been warmed by anything for a very long time, when it has been sitting in the dark of an inner sanctuary where sunlight does not reach and where the air itself seems to have given up moving. A worshipper who came to Epidaurus seeking a dream came prepared for this. They had bathed, they had fasted, they had made what offering they could afford at the altar outside, and then they had passed through the inner doors and lain down on the floor of the sanctuary with a cloth or a thin mat beneath them, their eyes closed, their breathing deliberately slowed, waiting. This was incubation. The word comes from the Latin incubare, meaning to lie upon, and what the worshippers at Epidaurus were lying upon was not merely cold stone, but the expectation, held seriously and with genuine religious weight, that a divine figure would come to them in sleep and speak. The sanctuary belonged to Asclepius, the god of healing in the Greek tradition, a figure whose own origin lay in myth, the son of Apollo, trained in medicine by the centaur Chiron, eventually killed by Zeus for the transgression of raising the dead, then restored to divine status and worshipped throughout the ancient world at hundreds of sacred sites. His sanctuaries were places where the divine and the human were understood to be genuinely, practically in contact, not symbolically, not metaphorically. The worshippers at the Abaton believed, with the conviction of their entire religious upbringing, that what happened in that room when they slept was real. The sanctuaries of Asclepius were spread across the ancient Greek world, on the island of Kos, in Athens, in Corinth, in dozens of other cities and settlements where people came carrying ailments, injuries, and questions that ordinary means had not resolved. Epidaurus in the northeastern Peloponnese was among the most important of these sites. The sanctuary there was large and elaborate, with a theater and baths and accommodations for the visitors who came from considerable distances to undergo the ritual. But the abaton itself, the inner hall where the sleeping took place, was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be still. The conditions the worshippers endured, the fasting, the cold floor, the deliberate preparation, were understood not as punishment, but as a kind of clearing, a removal of the ordinary noise of bodily life, that might allow something quieter and stranger to come through. What came through, according to the records that survive, was often the figure of Asclepius himself. He appeared in dreams wearing his characteristic attributes, carrying a staff, accompanied by a serpent, sometimes by a dog, and he spoke to the sleeping worshippers, touching the afflicted part of the body, prescribing remedies, or sometimes simply healing through the touch itself. The worshipper would wake on the cold stone and lie still for a moment, the dream still present behind the eyes, understanding from everything their tradition had taught them that what had occurred in that room was not ordinary. It was not the mind producing images from the residue of the day. It was a god visiting in the night in the form the tradition had always described. Inscribed on stone tablets found at Epidaurus are the records of hundreds of these encounters. These tablets are called the iamata. The word relates to the Greek verb for healing, and they stand now in the Archaeological Museum at Epidaurus, their surfaces carved with names, ailments, and the specific dreams that came to the people who bore those names. A man named Nicanor is recorded as having come to the sanctuary with a paralysis of his fingers. He slept on the floor of the abaton. In his dream, a young boy appeared and seized his hand. He woke with his fingers restored. A woman named Ambrosia, blind in one eye, is recorded as having been treated in her dream by Asclepius himself, who cut open the afflicted eye and poured a medicine into it, and woke the following morning able to see. The specificity of the records is striking. Name, ailment, dream, outcome, all committed to stone in the 2nd and 4th centuries BCE by the sanctuary's priests, who curated the accounts and inscribed the most striking on tablets that would stand in the precinct as testimony. Whether any particular account is literally accurate in the terms a modern observer would apply is not the point. The point is that the institution existed, that it was taken seriously enough to be maintained across centuries, that worshippers traveled to it from considerable distances, that the sanctuary's priests considered the record worth the effort of inscription, and that the physical evidence of those stones remains. The iamata at Epidaurus are one of the richest surviving archaeological records of institutionalized religious dreaming in the ancient world. They are not marginal curiosities. They are the central business of a major sanctuary, carried out with formality and care over a very long period of time. Epidaurus was not the only place this practice was conducted. At virtually every sanctuary of Asclepius across the Greek world, some version of incubation took place. The ritual form varied by location and period, but the underlying assumption remained constant across all of them, that the sleeping human mind was, under the right conditions, genuinely permeable to divine presence, and that what arrived in that sleep could be trusted to have come from somewhere other than the dreamer's own recollection or wish. This was not a marginal folk belief held by the uneducated and left unexamined. It was an assumption built into the structure of Greek religious life, given formal institutional expression, and treated with the seriousness of a practice that demonstrably worked insofar as people continued to come, and the records continued to be kept, and the stones continued to be carved with new names and new ailments and new accounts of what occurred in the sanctuary in the dark. The distinction between different kinds of dreams occupied serious thinkers throughout the ancient world, because not every dream that came in sleep was understood to carry the same weight or the same origin. Artemidorus of Daldis, who lived and worked in the 2nd century CE, spent his life attempting to systematize what was known about this question, and the result of that labor was a work called the Onera Critica, a title that translates roughly as the interpretation of dreams, though the Greek is more specific than that, pointing toward a critical, analytical approach to dream content rather than mere collection or description. Artemidorus compiled the Onera Critica across several volumes, and what survives is one of the most extensive and methodical ancient treatments of the subject. Artemidorus was not a priest at a sanctuary. He was a practitioner, a professional interpreter of dreams, who worked in the markets and public spaces of the ancient world, consulting with people who came to him carrying the residue of the night before and needing help understanding what it meant. He traveled widely, consulted with other interpreters, read everything that had been written on the subject before him, and took pains to record his methods and his case studies so that his work could be evaluated and built upon. The Onera Critica is the product of this sustained, practically oriented effort, and one of its most important contributions is the formal distinction it draws between two categories of dream. The first category, Artemidorus calls the enhypnion, the ordinary dream, the dream that reflects bodily states, anxieties, wishes, and the accumulated content of waking experience. A man who goes to bed hungry and dreams of a banquet is having an enhypnion. A woman who fears for a sick child and dreams of the child's recovery is having an enhypnion. These dreams are not without interest, Artemidorus holds, but they do not require the kind of interpretive attention he devotes most of the Onera Critica to, because they are not of divine origin. They are the mind processing what the body and the day have left behind. The second category is the Oneros, and this is the word, the same word that gives the Oneroi their name, that denotes a dream of prophetic significance, a dream that has arrived from somewhere outside the dreamer's own experience and is carrying information about something that has not yet happened. The Oneros requires interpretation precisely because it does not say its meaning plainly. It speaks in symbols and figures, in displacement and compression, in the language of imagery rather than statement. Artemidorus's project is to build a working key to that language, to accumulate enough case material, enough observations of the relationship between what appeared in the dream and what subsequently occurred in waking life, that a practitioner with the right training can move between the two registers with reasonable confidence. His case studies are specific and often striking. A man dreams of losing a tooth and subsequently loses a relative. Another man dreams of his own death and wakes to inherit an estate, because death in a dream, Artemidorus argues, carries the symbolic weight of transformation, of passing from one condition to another, which can be interpreted as a change of fortune as readily as literal mortality. A woman dreams of walking barefoot in mud and interprets this with Artemidorus's guidance as a sign that her current situation is unstable but traversable. The method is not arbitrary. It is built from pattern, from the accumulated observation of what has followed what, in hundreds of cases recorded with names and outcomes, and the specific imagery that was said to have preceded them. Artemidorus is careful about his sources. He notes where he agrees with earlier interpreters and where he differs. He records the regional variations in symbolic meaning. An image that is propitious in one city may carry a different weight in another, because symbolism is not universal, but embedded in local custom and association. He treats dream interpretation as a discipline, requiring genuine knowledge, not mere intuition, and he writes about it with the professional seriousness of someone who believes the subject is worth the effort of precision. Across the centuries since his death, the Wanera Critica has been studied by scholars of entirely different traditions, translated into Arabic, influential in the Islamic dream interpretation literature that followed, eventually translated into Latin and then into the European vernacular languages, as the ancient materials were recovered and reread. The book has not stopped traveling. The assumption that meaningful dreams originated with Zeus and constituted genuine divine communication ran deep through Greek religious life, deep enough to shape not only what people thought about their dreams, but what they did in response to them. A significant dream, a dream that felt in the immediate aftermath of waking, like more than the ordinary processing of a tired mind, demanded not merely attention, but often a formal response. The dreamer might go to an interpreter like Artemidorus. They might consult the priests at a local sanctuary. They might undertake a sacrifice or a vow in acknowledgement of the communication they believed they had received. The dream was not a private psychological event to be noted and set aside. It was a message in a language that required decoding, and decoding it was a matter of religious obligation as much as personal curiosity. In the tradition Homer preserves in the Iliad, this assumption finds one of its most striking expressions. Zeus, wishing to set in motion the events of a particular day of fighting, sends a dream to the commander of the Greek forces assembled at Troy. The figure of the dream travels swiftly across the dark, wearing the face and bearing the voice of Nestor, the most trusted advisor among the Greek leaders, an old man whose authority rests on age and long experience, whose counsel carries the particular weight of someone who has outlasted most of the reasons to doubt him. The dream settles at the sleeping king's head and begins precisely as Zeus has instructed, to speak. What it says is not true. The dream sent to Agamemnon in the Iliad is a false dream, a deception, sent by the king of the gods with the specific purpose of misleading the Greek commander about what a particular day of battle will bring. Agamemnon wakes believing the gods have promised him victory. He calls his council and his army together and commits to an assault on Troy based on what the dream has told him. The day does not go as the dream predicted. This is not an accident of the story or a theological embarrassment that the tradition has to explain away. It is a feature of the Homeric understanding of how the divine and human worlds interact, a world in which Zeus is not bound by the moral obligation to send only true communications, in which the gods pursue their own purposes through human experience, and in which the dreamer's conviction that a message is genuine does not guarantee that the message is accurate. The false dream sent to Agamemnon occupies the same theological architecture as the healing dreams at Epidaurus and the prophetic Wanairoi that Artemidorus spent his life trying to classify. All of them arise from the same conviction that divine figures could travel through sleep to reach sleeping minds, that the form a dream took was chosen deliberately by whatever sent it, and that the relationship between the dream and its meaning required careful navigation. The possibility of deception was built into that architecture from the beginning. The gate of horn and the gate of ivory that Homer and Virgil both describe, the passage through which true dreams travel and the passage through which false ones come, acknowledge explicitly that not every dream arriving in the night carries genuine information. The tradition knew this. Artemidorus knew it. The worshippers at Epidaurus knew it too, which is why the incubation ritual was designed so carefully. The purification and the fasting and the sacred precinct all working together to create conditions under which a genuine divine encounter was more likely and a misleading one less so. The question of how to tell the difference is one that the tradition never fully resolved, which is perhaps why Artemidorus needed so many case studies and why the sanctuary at Epidaurus needed to carve so many accounts on stone. Each individual instance was evidence. Each verified outcome was another piece of a pattern that no single dreamer's experience could establish alone. The practice of interpretation was collaborative in this sense, even when it was conducted in solitude, the interpreter drawing on hundreds of other dreamers' experiences to make sense of this one, the sanctuary stones making the community of dreamers visible across centuries. The Abaton at Epidaurus stood for a very long time. People slept on its floor through the height of the classical period, and into the Hellenistic age, and into the Roman period, when sanctuaries of Asclepius became sites of something that looked, from a certain angle, like what would now be called medical tourism, people traveling to the sanctuary, seeking cures, sleeping in the prescribed manner, consulting with the priests, receiving whatever the night brought. The Roman orator Aelius Aristides, who lived in the 2nd century CE and left an extensive record of his experiences with the healing cult of Asclepius, fills his surviving writings with the dreams that came to him over the course of a long and complicated relationship with the god's sanctuary. He describes the dreams in detail, the figure that appeared, what it said, what Aristides subsequently did in response, how the waking events that followed appeared to confirm or complicate the dream's instructions. For Aristides, the dreams were not supplementary to religious practice, they were the substance of it. The interpreter Artemidorus, working in the same century as Aristides, was doing something different, but drawing on the same deep assumption. He was not primarily interested in healing dreams, or in the specific encounter between a worshipper and the figure of Asclepius. He was interested in the whole vast field of meaningful dreaming, in the symbolic logic that governed how divine intention was translated into the imagery a sleeping mind could receive, and in the practical question of how a trained interpreter could move reliably between the image and its meaning. The Vanera Critica begins with a formal statement of purpose, an explanation of why the subject deserves systematic treatment, and that statement is made with the seriousness of someone who considers their work genuinely important, not because dreams are interesting curiosities, because in Artemidorus's world, getting the interpretation wrong had consequences. He collected his case material everywhere. He talked to interpreters at markets and festivals and sacred sites across the eastern Mediterranean world. He read the works of predecessors, many of whose names survive only because Artemidorus cites them. He distinguished between interpreters he considered reliable and those he thought were charlatans, applying a professional judgment that required him to have standards, to have thought carefully about what a good interpretation looked like and what distinguished it from a convenient or flattering one. The Vanera Critica is the surviving record of all of that accumulation, not a treatise of pure theory, but a working tool built from specifics intended for use. One of the things Artemidorus insists on is that the same image does not always mean the same thing. Context matters. The dreamer's occupation, social position, current circumstances, and recent history all affect what a given symbol is pointing toward. A dream of water means something different to a sailor than to a farmer. A dream of death means something different to an old man than to a young one. An image of snakes which in the Greek tradition carries associations with healing, wisdom, danger, and the divine, often simultaneously, must be read in relation to everything else the dream contains, and everything the Artemidorus knows about the dreamer's situation. This contextual sensitivity is one of the marks of what Artemidorus considers a competent interpreter, and his insistence on it runs against any simple scheme of fixed symbolic equivalences. The dream is not a code to be cracked with a key. It is a language that has grammar as well as vocabulary, and reading it requires fluency, not just a dictionary. What makes the Wanira Critica particularly striking as a document is the texture of individual experience it preserves. Behind the systematic presentation of cases and categories, there are people. There is the man who dreamed of losing his tooth and subsequently found himself at a funeral. There is the woman who dreamed of a broken sandal and woke to discover the meaning of that particular symbol in the context of a particular mourning in a particular city in the 2nd century CE. The dreams recorded in the Wanira Critica are not abstract illustrations of a system. They are the residue of actual nights, actual sleepers, actual mornings on which someone lay still for a moment, uncertain what had come to them in the dark, before going out to find someone who could help them understand it. That scene, a person lying still after waking, the dream still present, not yet dismissed, recurs throughout the ancient materials on dreaming in many forms. It is in the sanctuary inscriptions at Epidaurus, where the worshippers waited on the cold floor. It is in the Homeric account of Agamemnon, who woke from his dream and dressed immediately in his royal clothing, moved to action by what the night had brought. It is in the implied figure behind every case study in the Wanira Critica, the person who came to Artemidorus in the market and began carefully to describe what they had seen. In all of these instances, the fundamental posture is the same, a person who has woken from a significant dream, and who understands from everything their culture has taught them that the correct response is attention, not dismissal, not distraction. Attention, and then interpretation, and then, often, action. The Greek word for this kind of meaningful dream, the waniros, the dream of divine origin that carries information about something not yet known, is the same word that gives the collective of dream spirits their name. This is not a coincidence of translation. It reflects something about the way the tradition held the relationship between the divine figures and the experiences they were believed to produce. The Waniros were not merely allegorical personifications of an abstract phenomenon. They were Greek understanding, the agents of a practice, the beings through whom Zeus or Juno, or the gods in general, communicated with sleeping mortals, the craftsmen of the experiences that the Epidaurian worshippers were waiting for on the cold stone floor, the entities whose work Artemidorus was spending his life trying to read. The sanctuary at Epidaurus fell into disuse as the ancient world changed around it. The great center of Asclepius worship at Pergamon, in what is now western Turkey, lasted somewhat longer. Alius Aristides consulted the god there through the 2nd century CE. Eventually, the practices that had sustained these sanctuaries for centuries were displaced by the religious shifts of the late antique world, though something of the underlying assumption that dreams could carry communication from beyond the ordinary waking mind persisted in different forms, in different traditions, translated into different theological frameworks. The stones at Epidaurus remained. The inscriptions on them held their names and their accounts and their ailments. The cold dark of the Abaton was there long after the last worshipper had lain down on its floor. Artemidorus's books traveled further, copied and recopied through the Byzantine period. translated into Arabic by scholars who found his systematic approach compatible with the dream interpretation traditions within Islamic religious life, eventually reappearing in Latin and European translations as the ancient materials were recovered in the Renaissance, and after, the Onira Critica maintained its slow, persistent journey through time. Sigmund Freud, who published his own interpretation of dreams at the very end of the 19th century, and who was in many respects resuming a conversation the ancient world had been conducting for a very long time, owned a copy of Artemidorus. He noted it, read it, cited it, and then largely set it aside, on the grounds that Artemidorus's method was too dependent on cultural context and external event, and not sufficiently focused on the internal workings of the individual mind. That criticism is itself interesting because it marks exactly the boundary between the ancient approach and the modern one. Artemidorus assumed the dream was primarily about something outside the dreamer, arriving from a divine source, pointing toward a future event. Freud assumed the dream was primarily about something inside the dreamer, generated by the mind's own mechanisms, pointing toward a past experience. Both of them thought the dream was worth a lifetime of attention. They simply disagreed about which direction it was pointing. The people who slept on the floor at Epidaurus would not have understood Freud's question in those terms. For them, the direction was not in doubt. The dream came from outside, from a god who had chosen, for reasons the worshipper might never fully understand, to arrive in the night and speak. What the god said was the thing that needed careful attention: the cold floor, the darkness, the long preparation of fasting and purification. All of that was the work of making oneself available to the arrival, not creating the dream from the materials of one's own experience, but clearing away enough of those materials to allow something else to come through. Whether or not anything came through on any given night on the cold floor of the Abaton is a question the Ayamata stones are not able to answer with the kind of certainty a modern inquiry might want. What they can answer is a different and in some ways more interesting question, which is what the people who made them believed. The answer to that question is legible in the stone. They believed that the dream was real. They believed that the figure who came in the night was genuinely present. They believed that the distinction between what arrived through the gate of horn and what arrived through the gate of ivory mattered, and that the work of telling them apart was worth the effort of a lifetime of careful attention. They carved the names and ailments and accounts into stone, not as entertainment, not as record-keeping for its own sake, but as testimony, as evidence offered to future visitors that the god had come, and that the coming had been worth the cold floor and the long preparation and the faithful willingness to lie still and wait. Artemidorus sits now in the memory of his notebooks, the case studies still legible across the centuries, the dreams of strangers still preserved in the system he built to hold them. A man who spent his working life in the conviction that the images arriving in sleep were worth the effort of understanding, that they were not noise but signal, not private elaboration but genuine communication, however difficult to read and however easily misread by an interpreter without sufficient care or knowledge. He traveled to collect what other interpreters knew. He argued with their conclusions. He built his taxonomy from thousands of specific instances and insisted, against any simpler approach, that the same dream means different things in different mouths, in different lives, in different seasons of a person's particular time on earth. The cold floor at Epidaurus. Nwyrnan shrieks, the carved stones recording name after name, ailment after ailment, dream after dream. The market in Ephesus or Smyrna, where a man approaches Artemidorus and begins quietly, carefully, to describe what he saw last night. The figure that came, the voice that spoke, the feeling on waking that something had arrived from somewhere beyond the ordinary running of the day. Artemidorus listens. He asks his questions. He turns the case over in his mind alongside everything else he has accumulated, all the other dreamers, and all the other mornings, and he begins with the professional conviction of someone who has spent a very long time believing that this is worth the effort to interpret. In a small pharmacy in Einbeck, in the German state of Lower Saxony, sometime in the first years of the 19th century, a young pharmacist's assistant named Friedrich Surturner held a crystalline white powder in a glass dish and looked at it for a long time. The powder was fine and pale, almost luminous against the dark surface beneath it. He had extracted it through a careful process from raw opium, a brown resinous substance that had been collected from the dried heads of a particular flowering plant, the same plant that had appeared for 2,000 years in the art and poetry of the ancient world, nodding its heavy seed heads at the entrance to the cave where the god of sleep was said to lie on his black ebony bed. Surturner had isolated the primary active compound. He needed a name for it. The name he chose was morphium. He took it from Morpheus, the dream-shaping son of Hypnos, the figure that the ancient tradition held responsible for the convincing human forms that appeared inside sleeping minds. The god associated in the oldest poetic sources with the poppy itself, with the heavy-headed flower that carpeted the floor of the cave of sleep in Ovid's account, and whose pharmacological properties the ancient Greeks had known and used for centuries as a sedative and a reliever of pain. Surturner reached across 2 millennia and borrowed the name with intention and explicit acknowledgement that the white compound he had isolated could produce deep, dream-saturated unconsciousness of a kind the ancient tradition would have recognized as belonging to the god's particular domain. The compound entered the medical literature. It was eventually standardized into what is now known as morphine, and so the name of the dream shaper passed from a Roman poet's cave of poppies into every hospital and pharmacy in the modern world, carried forward on the pharmacological properties of a flower the ancient Greeks had already understood. There is something worth sitting with in that continuity. It is not a metaphor. Surturner was not making a poetic gesture when he named his compound after the god. He was observing that the substance did what the god was said to do. It produced states of deep unconsciousness in which vivid internal experiences unfolded, states that lay precisely at the boundary between ordinary sleep and the oblivion that the ancient world associated with Morpheus's father and his uncle. The poppy had always been the plant of that boundary. The plant appears on ancient Greek vases beside the figure of Hypnos, depicted as an attribute the way a lion is depicted beside Athena, or an eagle beside Zeus. It appears in Ovid growing thickly at the entrance to the cave of sleep, so densely packed that their nodding in the still air was the only movement in a place where no wind came. The pharmacological reality of the plant was not unknown to the people who made those images. They knew it produced sleep. They placed it beside the god of sleep because it did what the god did. A single dried poppy head, nodding on its stem, its gray-green seed pod, heavy and slightly waxy, its long neck curved under the weight. This is the same plant. The one in the ancient vase painting and the one in the pharmacist's supply cabinet are the same species, Papaver somniferum, the poppy of sleep, the plant whose Latin name already contains the god's domain. What Surturner did was to follow the thread that the ancient world had already laid down. From the flower to the figure, from the figure to the function, from the function to the compound that now carries the function's name forward, in the form of a white crystalline powder, that a person in a modern hospital might receive before a surgery, dissolving into the same deep, form-filled unconsciousness that Ovid described in the cave on the black ebony bed. The poppy itself is a delicate thing to hold in mind for a moment. Its petals are thin and slightly translucent, the kind of red that looks as though light is passing through it rather than reflecting from it. The seed head underneath is architectural, rounded and precise, capped with a small crown of radiating lines. It blooms quickly and the petals fall. What remains is the pod, the part that matters to the pharmacologist, the part that yields under pressure the sticky dark resin from which everything else descends. In the ancient world, this was understood as something the plant gave willingly, the way Hypnos was understood to give sleep willingly, turning toward the world each night with his particular gift. The flower was not dangerous in the old framing. It was generous. What it offered was rest. What it offered, in larger quantities, was a rest so deep it approached the condition of Hypnos's twin, the one who governed the permanent version of that same stillness. The ancient world knew this distinction and held both ends of it with the same calm attention it applied to everything that lay at the boundary between the living and the not yet dead. Sir Turner's laboratory bench in Einbeck would have been an ordinary work table, wooden, stained, holding the tools of a pharmaceutical trade that was in his era, still partly alchemical in its methods, still built around the physical transformation of natural substances into concentrated forms. The glass dish, the mortar, the solutions and precipitates, the careful records of what had been done and in what order. Behind him on a shelf, almost certainly, a supply of raw opium, the brown lump of resin that had traveled from wherever it was harvested to a pharmacy in a small German town to sit on a shelf until someone decided to take it apart and find out what was inside it. The poppy on the shelf behind him connected the room to Ovid's cave as directly as any physical object could connect one moment to another across that span of time. The plant was the same, the properties were the same. The name Sir Turner chose acknowledged all of this, the continuity, the antiquity, the long chain of association that ran from a flowering field somewhere in the ancient Mediterranean through 2,000 years of art and poetry and medical practice to a glass dish in a German pharmacy holding a compound no one had isolated before. Morphine is now understood in precise molecular terms. It binds to opioid receptors in the brain, reducing the perception of pain and producing profound sedation. It alters the relationship between the brain and the signals arriving from the body in a way that makes the body's distress seem distant, manageable, held at a remove that allows sleep to arrive. None of this was known to Sir Turner in those terms. He knew what the compound did, not yet why, but the gap between knowing what and knowing why is where names live, and the name he chose was drawn from a tradition that had been trying to account for the same set of experiences for 2.5 millennia. What the tradition called Morpheus, the chemistry eventually called a receptor agonist. Both descriptions are trying to account for the same thing, the mechanism by which a sleeping mind is given vivid, convincing internal worlds in which known figures appear and speak, and the dreamer cannot tell the difference between what is happening inside the dream and what would be happening if they were awake. The question of what dreams are, held in the space between the ancient account and the scientific one, has never been fully settled. The ancient tradition held that they came from outside, that Morpheus carried them from the divine world to the sleeping mortal, that they arrived as gifts or as messages, or occasionally as deceptions sent by figures with specific intentions. The scientific account holds that they arise from inside, that the dreaming brain is generating its own content, constructing scenes and figures and narratives from the material of its own accumulated experience, running processes that have to do with memory consolidation and emotional regulation and the rehearsal of social scenarios. These two accounts are not as far apart as they first appear. Both describe the same phenomenon, a sleeping person experiencing a vivid, convincing internal world populated by figures who behave like real people, delivering experiences that feel, while they last, as real as waking life. The ancient tradition gave that phenomenon a name, a genealogy, a set of specific abilities. The scientific tradition gave it a mechanism. Eugene Osorinsky was a graduate student at the University of Chicago in 1953 when he made the observation that changed the scientific understanding of sleep. He had been studying the eye movements of sleeping subjects, recording them with an electroencephalograph, a machine that traces the electrical activity of the brain through small sensors placed against the scalp, drawing its record as a series of wavy lines on a moving scroll of paper. Most sleep produced a slow, undramatic readout, but at certain intervals during the night, something different happened. The eyes of sleeping subjects began to move rapidly beneath their closed lids. Not the slow drifting movements of light sleep, but quick, purposeful, coordinated movements. The kind of movements that eyes make when they are tracking something moving in the visual field. As Osorinsky noticed this, and to confirm that the machine was not malfunctioning, woke the subjects during these episodes. The subjects reported vivid, narrative dreaming, reliably, consistently, every time. The stage of sleep associated with rapid eye movement was named accordingly, REM sleep, the stage in which dreams, in the vivid narrative sense, most reliably occur. The EEG readout during REM sleep looks almost like the readout during waking. The brain during a REM episode is busy, active, engaged, processing. It is generating internal experience of a kind that is indistinguishable from the inside, from waking perception. Osorinsky watched the pen trace its distinctive rapid zigzag across the paper at 2 in the morning in a darkened laboratory, while through the glass the subject lay still, eyes moving beneath closed lids, inhabiting a world that existed nowhere except inside the activity of the sleeping brain. The observation was so unexpected that Osorinsky initially suspected the machine was broken. He checked it. It was working correctly. What the machine was reading was a sleeping mind that had turned for this interval fully inward, processing, constructing, experiencing. The discovery that vivid dreaming was associated with a specific and identifiable stage of sleep came with an additional observation that bears sitting with. REM sleep does not occur once per night. It occurs in cycles, recurring roughly every 90 minutes throughout the course of a full night of sleep, with each cycle producing a progressively longer REM episode. The first REM period of the night might last only a few minutes. The final one, the one that occurs in the hours before a natural waking, can last half an hour or more. This means that the most extended and vivid dreaming of any given night happens in the hour or two before waking, that the figures inside the dream have in those final cycles the longest uninterrupted time in which to do what they were said to do. In the ancient account, Morpheus would have been most fully at work in that last long interval before dawn, when the dreamer is deepest in the narrative, when the constructed figures have had the most time to settle into their convincing human forms. The brain structure most active during REM sleep is the amygdala. On neuroimaging scans, it appears in warm color, lit with activity at a level that exceeds what is recorded during most waking states, brighter than a resting waking brain, more active than during ordinary attention. running at a pace that produces the characteristic emotional intensity of dreams. The amygdala processes emotional responses of all kinds, not only fear but reward, recognition, attachment, grief, the particular quality of feeling that accompanies seeing a known face or hearing a known voice. During REM sleep, the structure is more active than at almost any other time in the 24-hour cycle. This is why dreams feel urgent. This is why the figure that appears in a dream and speaks with the voice of someone loved produces, in the dreamer, an emotion indistinguishable from the emotion that figure's real presence would produce. The brain is not producing a pale copy of waking experience. It is producing something at full emotional intensity, the amygdala running warm, the body responding as though what the mind is generating is entirely real. Alcyone, in the myth that Ovid preserves in the Metamorphoses, weeps in her sleep when the figure of the drowned Cex appears before her. She reaches toward it. She speaks to it. The grief she experiences inside the dream is not a weakened version of waking grief. It is grief at full force, the recognition of loss landing with the same weight it would land with in waking life, because the brain structures that generate and register grief do not distinguish between an external event and the internally generated equivalent. This is what the ancient tradition attributed to Morpheus specifically, not merely the creation of a convincing image, but the creation of a convincing emotional experience. The figure he shaped was not just visually accurate, which theme moved correctly, stood correctly, used the voice's exact quality and cadence. It arrived at full resolution, at the depth of detail required to produce in the dreamer the full emotional response the real person would have produced. The amygdala, lit in warm color on the imaging scan, generates the same response to both. There is another threshold state worth resting with before the deeper territory of sleep. Hypnagogic hallucinations are the experiences that occur at the edge of sleep onset, not in the middle of a full REM cycle, but in the first minutes of falling asleep, when the brain is crossing from wakefulness into sleep, and its sensory processing systems are still active enough to generate experience, but the suppression of external input has already begun. A person lying quietly in the dark, eyes closed, beginning to drift, this is where hypnagogic hallucinations occur. Shapes assembling behind closed eyes, a voice beginning a sentence, distinct and close, apparently coming from somewhere in the room, a face forming out of the visual noise of closed eyelids, settling into something recognizable, the sensation, sometimes, of a hand or a presence, not menacing, simply present, as though the room has acquired a second occupant. These experiences are now understood to result from the brain's sensory processing systems, generating internal content before full sleep has suppressed external input. The brain does not simply turn off when sleep begins. It transitions gradually, and in that transition it produces, briefly, experiences that are indistinguishable from waking perception, sounds that seem to come from the room, images that seem to exist in the space behind closed eyes, presences that seem to occupy the same physical space as the sleeping body. The ancient world would have recognized this transition as the moment of Morpheus's arrival, the figure assembling itself at the edge of the bed before sleep had fully come, the form becoming distinct and recognizable in the seconds before full unconsciousness closed over the dreamer. The brain, in its contemporary account, is doing in its own language exactly what the ancient tradition attributed to the dream shaper, giving form to figures that feel for a moment completely real, arriving unbidden at the threshold of a sleeping mind. Sir Turner, in his pharmacy in Einbeck, was working at one end of this long continuity without knowing its full length. He knew the ancient name. He knew the plant's history and ancient art. He knew that the compound he had isolated produced states the tradition associated with that name. What he could not have known was how precisely the neuroscience that would come a century and a half after him would describe in cellular and electrochemical terms exactly what the ancient tradition had described in divine terms. The vivid construction of convincing inner worlds, the amygdala's warm activity, generating emotional experiences, indistinguishable from waking life, the threshold figures of the hypnagogic state, arriving at the edge of consciousness with the specificity and completeness that the ancient tradition credited to the steadiest hands among the sons of sleep. The poppy has its own patience. It grows in disturbed ground, in places where the soil has been broken open, roadsides, field margins, the cleared edges of things. It comes up in spring, and by early summer has already bloomed and dropped its petals, leaving the pod to ripen slowly through the warmest months. It is not a dramatic plant in its growth. It simply continues, putting up its gray-green stem, opening its thin petals for a few days, then closing around the seed pod that matters. In the ancient world, it was planted near sanctuaries. It was painted on the walls of temples of Asclepius, the god of healing, whose own sanctuaries were the sites of institutionalized sacred dreaming, where worshippers came to sleep on sacred ground and wait for a healing figure to appear in the night. The poppy was present in both contexts, the sleep-giving plant at the entrance to the god's cave, and the healing plant at the entrance to the healer's sanctuary. Sleep and healing were understood as related processes, related the way Hypnos and his son were related, the one providing the condition the other required. Morphine, the compound surturner extracted from that plant and named after that god, is still used in the same double context as a means of achieving deep sleep before surgical procedures, and as a means of reducing the suffering of people whose bodies need the relief that only deep unconsciousness can provide. The pharmacological history of the compound from 1804 to the present is a history of refinements and applications and misuses that belongs to a different kind of account than this one. What belongs here is simpler, a name that has traveled from an ancient Greek noun meaning form or shape, through a divine figure credited with the ability to give form to figures in sleeping minds, to a poppy plant carpeting the floor of a poetic cave, to a German pharmacy in the early 19th century, to the label on a pharmaceutical compound that arrives in the body and produces the same deep dream-saturated states the ancient account described, though the ancient account called the mechanism a god, and the contemporary account calls it a receptor. The question of which account is more accurate is less interesting for the purposes of this hour than the question of what both accounts are pointing at. They are both pointing at the same thing, a sleeping person in the final long REM cycle of the night, lying in whatever darkness their room provides, the amygdala running warm, the brain generating a complete internal world with full emotional fidelity, inhabited by figures whose voices and gestures and particular familiar qualities are assembled from the accumulated archive of a living memory, and the dreamer inside this world, unable to distinguish it from waking, reaching toward the figures that appear there, hearing what they say, feeling what their presence produces, until the dream ends or waking comes. The ancient tradition did not think this happened automatically. It assigned the construction of those figures to a craftsman, Morpheus, the son of sleep, the grandson of night, the figure among all the dream spirits, who alone possessed the skill to take on human form with sufficient precision that the dreamer could not detect the seam between the constructed figure and the real one. His name said what he did. He gave form. He shaped the morphe of the dream figure, assembled its walk and its voice, and the particular turn of its head, and then he stood inside the sleeping mind and delivered it, complete, at whatever emotional intensity the dream required. The science does not describe a craftsman, it describes a process, neural activity in specific structures, memory consolidation, the activation of emotional response systems, the generation of sensory experience through internal rather than external means. But the process produces exactly what the craftsman was said to produce: a complete figure, a convincing presence, an experience that, while it lasts, is as real as anything the waking world provides. The names for the two accounts are different. The thing they name is the same. In a neuroimaging scan, the sleeping brain during its final REM cycle of the night appears lit from within. The areas associated with visual processing are active, generating images with no light source to explain them. The areas associated with emotional response are warmer and brighter than they are during much of waking life. The areas associated with self-monitoring and rational evaluation are relatively quiet, which is why the dreamer does not step back and assess the dream's internal inconsistencies, does not notice that the room is the wrong room, that the person who appears has been dead for years, that the sequence of events does not follow the logic of the waking world. Those evaluating systems are dialed down. What is dialed up is the construction and the feeling, the generation of experience at full resolution and full emotional intensity, without the waking mind's habit of standing apart from what it perceives and questioning it. This is the condition that Morpheus required: a sleeping mind, with its critical capacities suspended and its emotional responsiveness intact, the exact conditions under which a constructed figure, assembled with sufficient care and precision, would be received without question and felt without distance. The ancient account understood, in its own terms, what made the dream shaper's work possible, not the darkness or the cave or the poppies at the entrance, though those were part of the account. What made it possible was the particular state of the receiving mind, suspended between waking and whatever lay beyond sleep, open to what arrived, unable to question it. In the final hour before dawn, the dreamer deepest in that last long REM cycle is in the condition Morpheus was said to favor for his most precise work. The constructed figures have had time to settle. The narrative has been running long enough to have the quality of something real rather than something beginning. The amygdala is warm. The visual processing systems are generating the scene in full detail. The critical systems that would, in waking life, notice the inconsistency or the impossible quality of what is being experienced are quiet enough to allow the experience to proceed without interruption. A person who was known and loved and is now gone can appear in this window and be fully present, fully voiced, fully embodied, arriving with the specificity and completeness that made Ovid describe Morpheus as the most skilled of all the dream spirits at imitating human form. The ancient tradition and the neuroscience are both describing this window. Both are pointing at the same darkness, the same sleeping mind, the same warm activity in the structures that generate and register love and grief and recognition. The dried poppy head on its stem outside the pharmacy window, in whatever season Sir Turner was working, was the same plant that had always been the same plant. Its pharmacological properties did not change between the era when Ovid placed it at the entrance to the cave of Hypnos and the era when Sir Turner extracted its primary alkaloid. What changed was the precision of the account. What became possible was the isolation of the active compound, the naming of the receptor, the imaging of the sleeping brain, the recording of REM sleep, on paper scrolls at 2 in the morning in a Chicago laboratory by a graduate student watching the pen trace something he initially thought must be a malfunction. All of these are the same story, told at different levels of resolution. The story is a sleeping mind generates complete internal worlds, populated by figures assembled with the precision of a craftsman, felt with the intensity of waking experience, and indistinguishable from reality, for as long as the sleep holds. Morpheus's name is in the compound that makes surgery possible. His name is in the words morphology and metamorphosis, the study of forms, the transformation of forms, carried forward in the language by the same ancient Greek root that described his function, the form giver, the shape maker, the one who assembled, from the available materials of memory and longing, a figure precise enough to stand in a sleeping mind and be believed. The scientific account and the ancient account share more than their subject. They share their fundamental recognition that what the sleeping brain does is not a diminished version of waking experience, but a different mode of the same capacity, the capacity to generate from internal materials a world that feels complete and real and populated by figures who matter. The ancient tradition honored this by assigning it to a craftsman of considerable skill, the son of a god, the grandson of a primordial goddess who existed before the ordering of the world. The scientific tradition honors it by studying it with the same care. The electrodes, the paper scroll, the darkened laboratory, the careful waking of subjects to confirm what the machine is reading. Both traditions are sitting with the same sleeping person. Both are looking at the same closed eyes, the same barely moving chest, the same quiet figure, lying in whatever darkness their bed occupies, generating inside their skull a world that no one else can enter and no one else can see. Both traditions understand that something is happening there that deserves careful attention. The name for what is happening differs. The thing that is happening does not. The amygdala in the scanning image is still warm. The dreamer is still deep in the final REM cycle of the night, the longest one, the one in which the figures inside the dream have had the most uninterrupted time in which to become completely themselves, to settle their voices, their gestures, the particular way they move through the constructed space of the dream,